Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the United States' increasing involvement in the Second World War. Of course, because this is an APUSH class, we're going to spend more time focusing on sort of domestic involvement, mobilization, the role of women and other groups in the war effort, and we're going to give a necessarily brief summary of the military actions in order for you to sort of understand the scope of the conflict, but not going into as much depth as you'd get a lot of other places. And so keep that in mind. If you are interested in the battles of World War II, there's a series of infinitely deep resources out there that I definitely encourage you to go delve into because it's a really fascinating and horrifying conflict. And for our purposes, we're going to do a mostly surface level discussion over the various fighting and fronts of the war. So here's our objectives for today. Let's take a moment and dive in. We're going to see in the Second World War a very similar phenomenon that we saw in the First World War, in that the US is going to use various government bureaucracies to help mobilize. For example, the War Productions Board is going to help transition industry from producing automobiles to producing planes, tanks, aircraft carriers, stuff like that. The War Manpower Commission is going to take the place of the National Labor Relations Board and is going to push us towards full employment. The Office of War Information is going to take the place of the Creel Commission, and we're going to see basically all the things that we saw during the First World War recreated under slightly different names, with the goal being the same: switch us into a wartime footing, and switch all of the massive manufacturing capacity of the United States towards producing war materials in order to metaphorically defeat these caricatures of our enemies. In order to do that, of course, we're going to have to mobilize women as well as men. And so Rosie the Riveter becomes this example of sort of feminine mobilization. She's both beautiful and strong, going to work and taking the jobs of men in order to ensure that we're able to win this war, because we're drafting millions of men into the military. And so women are going to have to take up a significant portion of this whole domestic production thing. So Rosie the Riveter represents that type of sort of wartime spirit. And then, of course, after the war, women's rights is going to expand to some extent, and we're going to have that conversation when we get there. Obviously, the war brings us to full employment, and so the Great Depression had created some pretty significant problems vis-a-vis labor, and so now we're going to almost immediately snap our fingers and mobilize all of American society. And so unemployment is going to go down to nothing. The War Manpower Commission is going to ensure that we're not having strikes or labor stoppages. There is some dispute with the Roosevelt administration because, as you remember, of course, the Wagner Act had legalized unions, and Roosevelt is very sort of hesitant to sign on to the Connolly-Smith anti-strike bill. But in the end, he's going to have to accede to this because strikes would disrupt the war effort. And so, yeah, that's an issue. The other problem, of course, is discrimination, both from the northern and southern manufacturers. Of course, Southerners have Jim Crow laws banning black people from participating in the way that we would hopefully like them to in order to fully mobilize society. De facto segregation and discrimination is also true in the North, is also present in the North. And so there's this big push to hopefully, by some, including Dr. Seuss, to pass laws in order to, stop discrimination and fully employ black Americans. A. Philip Randolph is going to try to organize a massive march on Washington. And so here's his proposed march on Washington. Take a moment, pause, and read. Having learned from the failures of African Americans to gain civil rights after the First World War, we hopefully remember Du Bois's "First Your Country, Then Your Rights," and then his disappointment afterwards. A. Philip Randolph is going to settle for nothing less than huge civil rights gains. So he and other civil rights leaders are going to prepare to use the war to sort of paint Jim Crow as similar to the oppression and racism of the Nazi and Japanese regimes. And the NAACP is going to push the Double V campaign: victory against our foreign enemies, fascism and militarism, and victory at home over racism and Jim Crow. And so there's this real attempt to tie the racism of sort of America's adversaries to some of the treatments of black people in the South. And as a result of this, Roosevelt is going to sign Executive Order 8802, which desegregates government, the war industries at least. So we're going to ban segregation within America's war industries. And so this is a step forward as far as civil rights goes. And look, here's a propaganda poster of a white guy and a black guy working together in order to defeat our enemies. So, Lincoln ended slavery, FDR desegregated the war industries. It's basically the same thing, similar to the Booker T. Washington, Theodore thing. And so it's a step forward. And in the end, Philip Randolph does not organize a march on Washington, and it's a step closer to desegregation. So, solid. We're going to significantly embrace migrant workers during this time period. Obviously, a demand for farm laborers was pretty extensive throughout the war. And so in order to fulfill all of these farm vacancies, the U.S. is going to push what's called the Bracero Program, which allows migrant workers from Mexico to enter the United States in order to fill farm-related jobs during wartime. This is going to become, of course, a regular policy after this, and migrant workers crossing the border in order to work in industries that can't find Americans to work there is going to become a common sort of theme in the second half of the 20th century. In order to make sure that we have enough, we're also going to have rationing in a much larger extent than we did in World War I. You, of course, have all of this fun propaganda sort of encouraging people to voluntarily use less, as we had during the First World War. I especially like the first poster, of course, but all of these are excellent. But we're also going to have actual ration cards. We're going to have ration books. There's going to be specific amounts of different products that people can buy. Sugar, coffee, meat, things like that. And so the government is going to take a much larger role in sort of distributing and rationing supplies, simply because World War II is such a larger undertaking than World War I. And we're also going to take efforts to try to eliminate black markets, although, of course, that's never really going to happen, because if you have enough money, basically anything is legal. We're going to see domestic racial tensions much more during World War II than we did during World War I. I mean, I know we saw the anti-German tensions and the Liberty sandwiches and Liberty cabbage stuff, but in World War II, racial issues are a much sort of more present thing. And so especially racism against the Japanese was pretty common. We're going to see sort of racial caricatures of our enemies, generally painting Mussolini and Tojo specifically as somewhat subhuman, which is, understandable because of our general sort of trends as far as, ranking various races. The Zoot Suit riots are also sort of an example of this. Zoot suits were a type of clothing that was preferred amongst Mexican American youth. They were sort of they were baggy, sort of high-waisted pants with loose-fitting jackets. And there was an outbreak of violence in Los Angeles where sailors were clashing with Mexican American youth on the streets of the city, over perceived slights and, whatever else. In the end, we have multiple accounts of who was responsible for the Zoot Suit riots. So in this telling from the Los Angeles Daily News, the Zoot Suiters were the aggressors. And in this telling, sailors were more or less wandering indiscriminately through neighborhoods, beating up Mexican-American youth. So, I'm not going to weigh in on the the veracity of these accounts. If you're interested in diving into the Zoot Suit riots, you can definitely do a deep dive and try to draw your own conclusions. But in the end, this represents sort of the overflow of ethnic and racial tensions in the United States during World War II. We also had Japanese-American internment during World War II. This is the first example of a time when we significantly singled out a specific ethnic group during wartime and treated them differently. There was a substantial fear amongst people on the West Coast that Japanese Americans were somehow disloyal, and the racism that we showed towards Japanese Americans was above and beyond what we showed to, German or Italian people. And so in the end, we'll take a moment and read this, but in the end, it was more of a appease the public type thing than a believing that Japanese Americans were actually a danger type thing. that led Roosevelt to sign his infamous executive order and imprison Japanese Americans in these prison camps without trial or without due process, forcing them to move, to sell their businesses, to sell their houses, to potentially abandon them and have them destroyed. And when people challenged this to the Supreme Court, sometimes the Supreme Court ruled that these people, that Japanese Americans should be set free. But the famous case of Korematsu versus United States established that it was okay to intern Japanese Americans. So, Supreme Court not doing great on supporting civil liberties at this point. Here's an account of what it was like for Japanese Americans to be interned. So take a moment, pause, and read, and then we'll move on. As far as the actual war goes, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Pacific and then a little bit of time talking about the European theater. In the Pacific, it took us a significant time to be able to mount offensives because of the damage to our fleet at Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, our aircraft carriers were not present at Pearl Harbor, and so we had the ability to counter Japanese movements much earlier than we would have if we had to start from scratch. Aircraft carriers, as we talked about earlier, are going to be the sort of quintessential warship of this fight, and so having operational aircraft carriers was absolutely essential. Our cryptographers also played a spectacular role in this war. American cryptographers deciphered pretty much every Japanese code, and we were able to read and decipher Japanese messages much more effectively than they were able to break our codes, mostly because of, well, at least partially because of the Navajo code talkers. So by using the Navajo language for a code, the United States was able to conceal many of their messages from the Japanese, and throughout the entire war, because Navajo is such a difficult language, the Japanese were never able to fully decipher American codes, giving us a substantial advantage in information, and in war, that's incredibly important. One of the first decisive battles was the Battle of the Coral Sea. This was a Japanese advance on Australia, in which several Japanese carrier groups, 3 Japanese carriers, met 2 U.S. carriers. This was one of the first aircraft carrier on aircraft carrier battles as the Japanese were moving towards potentially taking Port Moresby or maybe even threatening Australia. They were currently fighting in the island of New Guinea in unbelievably difficult jungle warfare. And so the Coral Sea, again, it's three aircraft carriers against 2. In the end, the Battle of the Coral Sea was really the first time in which aircraft carriers faced off, and we were still trying to figure out the strategy of this whole thing. In the end, 1 American aircraft carrier was sunk and 1 Japanese aircraft carrier was sunk. Both sides lost significant amounts of aircraft, and the battle is considered militarily indecisive, but it was a strategic victory for the United States because it stalled the Japanese advance on Australia. And it demonstrated for us, we learned a lot of lessons about how to effectively use aircraft carriers, how to shield aircraft carriers, and how to fight a war with aircraft carriers. The decisive battle for the United States was the Battle of Midway. We were able to, because had broken Japanese codes, know that they were going to descend on the island of Midway. And then to spectacularly oversimplify the battle, what happened was that the Americans waited until the Japanese were engaged, fighting the defenses on Midway Island. And then rather than try to defend the island, American carriers launched their planes to attack Japanese aircraft carriers. They were able to break through the fighter screen and were able to either damage or destroy all of the Japanese aircraft carriers at Midway. And this was incredibly important because it gave the U.S. a really, really overwhelming tactical advantage, because the Japanese would really never be able to launch another offensive without being significantly outnumbered in terms of aircraft carriers. And so that, combined with the U.S.'s massive advantage in production, is going to really put the Japanese on the defensive for the rest of the war. In the European theater, rather than launching an attack at Hitler's almost impregnable Atlantic Wall defenses, our first attack is going to be against French-occupied North Africa. We hoped that this would both put pressure on the Nazi regime, alleviate some pressure on Stalin, who was doing most of the fighting on the Eastern Front, and potentially be a place for us to test out new strategies, new tactics, try out a lot of the new weapons and landing crafts that we'd developed. And we'd hoped that the French would perhaps not put up a strong fight, considering most of them were not loyal to the Nazi regime. And this turned out to be mostly true. In the end, the French forces did not fight particularly hard for a regime that had conquered them. We were able to drive the Nazis out of North Africa. And this whole movement, led by our Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, was spectacularly successful. And so the first sort of U.S. actions in Europe or in the European theater were successful. And we were able to launch this planned invasion effectively and take over North Africa. Here's a description. Here's a description of what it was like to land in North Africa and testing out these new weapons. And hopefully, it's apparent to you why we felt like going against the French and sort of less defended positions, the soft underbelly of the Axis, was a better idea than launching it against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. From there, we launched an invasion of Italy in Operation Avalanche, first taking over the island of Sicily and then launching ground forces into Italy. The fight in Italy was incredibly challenging because of the difficult geography. Italy is pretty mountainous, and there were lots of, it would take a lot of time to sort of slowly work our way up the Italian peninsula. As Allied forces were doing this, Mussolini was overthrown, and the Italian people overthrew his government, and a rump state would continue to exist in the north until eventually Mussolini was captured and dragged through the streets and beaten and hung and all that. And so Mussolini is going to get knocked out of the war relatively early, but German forces are going to prevent a full Italian surrender, and fighting is going to continue on that theater for a while. But in general, the campaign in North Africa and in Italy was relatively successful, whereas the campaign that we're going to talk about for tomorrow, as we're moving through the Pacific, is going to be incredibly bloody and difficult. So this is just the overarching early phases of the war, going far too quickly through these operations. Again, if you're very interested in this, take some time, dive in. There's an infinite amount of resources out there. But for now, we're going to leave it there. So thank you for listening.